bom dia a todos e a todas. Obrigada pela sua presença aqui no Proformação. Sou a Kati Martins, criadora desse canal, e tenho a imensa alegria de receber vocês aqui nessa manhã de sexta-feira, tão cedo, para que nós possamos conversar a respeito de um tema absolutamente interessante. Nessa manhã eu convido meu colega professor Kleber Aparecido. Este evento não aconteceria se não fosse a nossa parceria Proformação e GECAL, Universidade de Brasília, Brasil, para quem nos escuta de fora. Nesse momento nós começamos o evento em língua portuguesa, mas o evento se dará em língua inglesa, em função dos nossos convidados serem convidados internacionais que não dominam a nossa língua. Muito bem-vindo, professor Kleber, é um prazer estar com você aqui, meu colega, meu amigo, para essa manhã tão frutífera aí de discussões e de aprendizagem. Seja bem-vindo.
Olá, Kátia, bom dia a você, bom dia a todos os nossos amigos, colegas, tanto do Brasil quanto de outros países que estão agora nos assistindo. Eu queria destacar, viu, Kátia, a minha grande satisfação de ter o Proformação como parceira dessa iniciativa acadêmica, que certamente será muito prazerosa para todos nós, será uma manhã muito frutífera, que certamente irá contribuir muito para o nosso crescimento acadêmico profissional. Então, eu queria, em nome do GECAL, nosso grupo de estudos críticos e avançados em linguagem, saudar toda a comunidade presente nesse evento. É com imenso prazer, uma honra hoje receber meus dois grandes amigos, o professor Leketi Makalela, meu supervisor de pós-doc, e o professor Finex Ndhlovu, meu outro parceiro da África, que está na Austrália, para a gente discutir um pouquinho sobre translinguagem. Então, eu gostaria, Kátia, para que eles pudessem entender o que eu estou dizendo, eu vou tentar saudá-los agora em inglês e dar boas-vindas também, já que a gente vai fazer sobre Translanguage. Vamos quebrar um pouco o protocolo, talvez, né?
Claro.
So, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor for us to begin our 10th Colloquial on Critical Applied Linguistics in the Global South. And today is a privilege, it's an honor for us to listen, to learning, and to interact with two great scholars, Professor Leketi Makalela and Professor Finex Ndhlovu. Professor Makalela and Professor Ndhlovu are welcome virtually at the University of Brasilia, Brazil. It's an honor for us to interact with you. I'm sure that you have a great colloquium and your presentation will contribute to transforming our academic life. I wish you, the audience, to have an excellent colloquium. You're welcome.
Muito bem. Vamos convidar aqui o nosso colega professor Oséias. Oséias irá mediar essa conversa conosco. Seja bem-vindo, Oséias Viana.
Obrigado.
Nesse momento, eu e o Kleber iremos nos retirar e deixar aqui Oséias com a apresentação dos nossos convidados. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos e eu espero que vocês aproveitem bastante essa manhã junto conosco. Obrigada, Oséias. É com você agora, meu querido.
Okay, thank you, Katia and Kleber. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, and I could say good evening too, because we are in very different time zones. But something that bonds us or link everybody here is that we are all connected for discussing something that we all is very important for us, right? So I would like to say that you all are welcome. Right, as I said, we are in very different time zones. Katia in Canada and Professor Finex in Australia and Professor Leketi in South Africa. So that's why my introductions and my greetings here is just saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. But you are all welcome. Right, before we start just a presentation as Katia did, my name is Oséias Viana Jr., and I'm a professor at the Federal University in the Agreste of Pernambuco, right? And here we'll be with you throughout this event. discussing very interesting topics, as I mentioned before. But before we start with the presentations, I would like to ask your permission to show you some slides. First, I'm going to say that we are broadcasting and it's been recorded. So you pay attention to this. This is first slide, right? That's what we are going to be discussing today, which is translanguaging, critical education, and decoloniality in South
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Good morning and good night. So as Professor Oséia said, we are in different time zones. Okay, so I am Lauro Pereira, and it's a pleasure to be here helping everybody. And we say sorry because Professor Oséia's had some internet connection problem from where he is. So as he was speaking, today's colloquium is entitled Translanguaging, Critical Education and Decoloniality in South Africa. And so we would like to say that it's very important for you to point your cell phone cameras to these QR codes, because we have two important partnerships with the Group for Critical and Advanced Language Studies from the University of Brasília, Brazil, and the project PROFFORMAÇAO, which has a YouTube channel. So make yourself comfortable to point the camera of your cell phone and subscribe on these channels. So now I have the honor to introduce one of the most important linguists from nowadays, who is Professor Finex Ndhlovu. Professor Finex Ndhlovu is Associate Professor of Language and Society in the School of Humanities, Arts, and School Sciences at the University of New England, Australia. Finex's research interests sit at the cutting edge of contemporary linguistic and social cultural theories around language, identity, and sociality in relation to transnational African migrant and diaspora communities, educational linguistics, epistemologies of the South, indigenous traditions of knowing, and decolonial theories. A key focus of his work is on how we might operationalize decolonizing as a methodology and an approach for charting the next steps in search for solutions to practical language-related problems in educational and other social policy areas. Finex has several academic publications consisting of a strong combination of research, monographs, edited volumes, book, chapters, journal articles, and non-traditional research outputs. Finex is the lead editor of the Routledge Handbook of the Decolonization of Languages and Cultures in contract with Routledge. And we also are going to have the honor to listen to Professor Leketi Makalela, who is also a PhD, and he is a full professor and founding director of the Hub for Multilingual Education and Literacies at the University of Witwatersrar in South Africa. He is a distinguished visiting professor at City University of New York. His research areas include translanguaging, multilingual education literacies. He is a rated researcher and holder of an endowed chair, South African Research Chairs Initiative on Multilingual Education for Social Inclusion and Access. His academic citizenship includes being a research convener for the National Reading Coalition of South Africa and an executive committee member of UmaLucy Council for Quality Assurance and an editor-in-chief of the Journal of South African Linguistics and Applied Language Studies. And today, we are going to have the pleasure to discuss some topics related to this very important book, which is Decolonizing Multilingualism in Africa, Recentering Silenced Voices from the Global South, which has just been released by Multilingual Matters publishers. So, and after that, I would like to invite the professors. The first one who is going to speak is going to be Professor Finex Ndhlovu. Professor Finex, welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Laura. I hope everybody can hear me and see my slides. Just want to start off by thanking you for inviting me to be part of this, and I appreciate the honor really to present at this colloquium today. So I will go straight. So as part of this presentation jointly with Leketi, I decided to prepare something titled Decolonizing Language in Education. Why decolonize? Why language? So I will try to address these questions as part of my talk today. First of all, I want to highlight that my role today, presenting jointly with Leketi, is to lay the groundwork. So my presentation is focusing on the methodological and conceptual issues or underpinnings of our project as presented in the recently published book. I will speak to key points around the methodology really of decolonization or decolonizing. First of all, I need to highlight that we've got to be aware that we live in a world that was shaped by over 500 years of coloniality. So issues around domination, control, epistemicides, which is the killing of knowledge systems, and linguicides, the killing of languages by all these colonial forces, all in the process of the exercising of power. So that's the context. And in the light of that, then decolonizing or the decolonial approach is not a slogan or an option, but it is a must for global social and cognitive justice. So if we are to achieve global social justice, global cognitive justice, then decolonizing is not just a slogan or an option, but it is something that we need to do. So the task of decolonizing then is an ongoing thing that requires us to think outside of the box as a way of trying to reopen and answer in a fresh way some questions that seem to have been settled several decades ago. So some of the questions that we focus on here in this project are the role of language in society and language in education, and also understandings of multilingualism and the kind of contestations that we find around that. So we argue in this project that to achieve this, we need to relearn to be good storytellers once again. So in the book, we start off by telling stories, stories of literacy acquisition, not in the Euro-modernist sense, but literacy practices of people that have not been exposed to modern Western education. So we tell the story, like I tell the story of my father in the book, and the story of Leketi's mother, how they navigated literacy practices that are far removed from the modernist practices of literacy. So this is about telling stories about how different traditions of reading and interpreting social realities do exist in different parts of the world, and they have to be recognized as part of what we mean by literacy. So our project is building on or informed by the ideas of leading decolonial scientists from Latin America and from Africa, people like Walter Mignolo, D'Souza Santos, and Sabelo Ndhlovu Kacheni, and others. So we are building on that. And when we talk of decolonizing, we are drawing on that. So this is just an introductory statement about the kind of work we are doing. Now, for today, I'm going to focus on 5 key points. I will talk about what it means to commit to a serious science, where we address questions that seem to have been seen as old questions, and yet they remain new because they have not been fully addressed. And then I'll move on to the next point, where I'll try to talk about the idea of the cognitive empire and its connection to the project of colonial linguistics. Then I will move to coloniality of language and the idea of linguistic ensettlement in language education, drawing specifically from the experiences in Africa. And I will look at briefly learning, how we can learn in partnership with Southern communities. Point number 5 really is about the book. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, so I will spare you a moment on that so that you can read the book. I'm not going to dwell a lot about the book, so you can get yourself a copy. But that's the other part, where we are trying to think otherwise or think differently in terms of how we understand and operationalize the notion of multilingualism. So we introduced 3 key concepts there. The concept of
Excuse
languages
me,
of the
I'm so
people.
sorry, Professor Finex. Excuse me.
Yes.
I just need to double check if you are skipping your slides, because in the transmission it's not skipping.
So you can't see my slides.
I can see, but it's still in the cover slide.
Oh no. Yeah, I'm moving my slides at my end
So
here.
you need to open it in the Google Chrome, where it is in the cloud, so you move it in the cloud, okay? Thank you.
Right. So you want me to, let me do it this way then. Can you see the slide I'm showing now?
It's still in the first one in the cover.
Oh.
So you need to open the tab in the Chrome. You need to skip it in the Chrome tab. I'm sorry.
Right. Can you see that I'm in Chrome now? What can you see?
I can see the first one, still the first one.
Okay. Can you see the next?
Yeah, now I can see the next one, which is a decolonial approach, laying the groundwork. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Can you see the points that are following there?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So maybe I'll show it this way then. All right. So I was at the outline. I just gone through the outline there. So I'll move to the next slide, where I'm raising the issue of old questions or new questions about coloniality of language. There's often a tendency for people to say, these things that you are talking about, these are old questions that have been addressed ages ago. But the argument I advance here is that for as long as a question has not been fully addressed, it remains forever new. It is not an old question because it has never been addressed. So the inequalities that we find in education, in society, more broadly, those inequalities that are connected to the project of global coloniality, they have been there for nearly over 500 years. And that is an endemic and enduring question that has not been addressed. So it's not an old question. So when we are in decolonizing and talking decoloniality, we are not addressing an old question. We are addressing a question that is forever new because it has never been resolved. We know many countries that were colonized, have gained independence and all of those kinds of things, political independence. But that is not the end of it all, because coloniality still remains. So the old question, what may seem as an old question, remains forever new until there is total cognitive justice, total social justice, and all of those kinds of things. The question remains new. So I will touch briefly here on an example that I always talk about. You know, that when you have a little child is asking for water or for a drink, and the adult who should be giving that child water, they don't give the child water, and the child keeps asking over and over again that I am thirsty, I need water. For as long as that child has not been given the water, she or he remains thirsty, and that question, that demand is not old. It remains new until the child has been satisfied and is no longer thirsty. So that's the same kind of an analogy I think that we need to apply here to the question of recognizing diverse traditions of knowing about language education, multilingualism, especially those from the global south, because they haven't been fully recognized. So these questions remain, have animated debates in the past, and they continue. So they are not old. They will always remain new, timely, and relevant for as long as they are yet to be fully addressed. Now, the next point I want to move on is, why is decolonization necessary? Why decolonize? So I put a point here about the global politics of knowledge and power. This is why we need to decolonize. I want to suggest that there is a reciprocal relationship among knowledge, power, and the legitimation of inequality, both in the academy and in society at large. So knowledge, power, and inequality, these things are connected at a global and a local scale. I also speak to what has been long described as the global politics of knowledge, and how the work we do as educationists is implicated in perpetuating or maintaining these inequalities and hegemonies in terms of knowledge production and validation. So the contemporary discourse on knowledge suffers from at least three major deficits or limitations. These are as follows. The first one is that of not taking a sufficiently critical view of what knowledge means. The second one is failure to address the political economic conditions and consequences of the production and use of knowledge, so which is the politics of knowledge. And third is the failure to adequately address what kinds of structural changes and attendant inequalities in the academy and society would follow from acknowledging the need to transform the epistemic basis of our contemporary knowledge culture. I quote the work of Hans Ndhlovu here. So I build on this to argue the following, that at the heart of social and political inequalities in society is language education policy, because planning language is ipso facto planning inequality. So when we plan languages for educational purposes, for literacy purposes, what we are doing, we are planning inequality, because there is a deliberate process of choosing and selecting and putting in a hierarchical order, the languages that are to be used either as languages of education, as medium of instruction, or languages to be taught as subjects. So why decolonize language education policy? It's because language policies are instruments for silencing and giving voice, through producing inequalities and hierarchies of both languages and people. Language planning is not a value-free enterprise. So language planning is contested, is ideologically laden, and is politically interested. So it invokes competing interests of diverse players. And this is why we need to decolonize the enterprise of language education policy. Language policies can determine who has access to schools, who has opportunities for economic advancement, who participates in political decisions, who has access to governmental services, and who gets treated fairly by governmental agencies. So whichever languages you choose to be the languages of school, they will be the medium by which people have access or lack of access to opportunities, political opportunities, and so forth. Another point is that language policies then can determine who gets ahead and who is left behind. And this is why it's important for us to decolonize this enterprise as a way of bringing about social and cognitive justice. Language policies can affect the prospects for ethnic groups and individuals in those groups. Next point is that often when you are in a situation where there are competing interests language-wise, it is symbolic power of language that settles the debate. So you find that in many countries, particularly former colonized parts of the world in the global south, in Africa, you talk of countries where English or Portuguese or French, was the language of everything. And in a situation where then, because these are multilingual societies, so people often make the convenient decision to say, okay, we have multiple varieties of languages. How do we choose which language is the language of education? So at the end of the day, it's symbolic power of particular language varieties that settles the debate. So people often make some false arguments to say, well, in the context of Southern Africa, for example, English is a neutral language. There's no such thing as a neutral language anyway. So English is a neutral language. So in the midst of all these multiple language varieties, let's just use English because it's neutral. But that is what I call the symbolic power of language, which then settles the debate. It's not necessarily about the neutrality. But the important thing is that the work we do in education, the texts we produce, they serve the rhetorical function of validating and legitimating these processes of exclusion and silencing that rest on colonial and neoclassical principles of economic rationalism. Because the process of language planning for education, for literacy purposes, follows an economic model, or should I say a colonial economic model. So how does economic modeling of language from a colonial perspective operates? We teach this all the time. When I'm teaching a course in language planning and policy, these are the things that you find. So you talk about their stages. So the stage of selection, codification, which is orthography writing systems and, choosing vocabulary items. And it goes to elaboration, so extending the use of into new domains, and then acceptance. So this is an economic modeling of language policy and planning. But at the end of it all, the goals are really to accord statuses to varieties, develop certain terminologies for use in particular contexts, particularly in education, and to improve the prestige or image of languages and acquisition planning and so forth. All of these processes, they are modeled along the lines of an economic or colonial economic model, which then translates into education. But when we are talking about teaching languages in education or using languages in education, this is a social matter. This is something that has more to do with people's traditions, their culture, their practices, and so forth. But all of those things are removed when you impose an economic model, which is quite simplistic, and inequalities, then exclusions and discriminations, they creep in as a consequence of that. So now, let me move to another point where I talk about imaginary creatures of coloniality. So, and trying to suggest that a serious science must move beyond imaginary creatures. So the process of language policy and planning produces particular types of languages, particularly standard languages, following the standard language ideology. So languages as things that are countable. So you produce what we call in our book languages of the state. And I call those imaginary creatures of coloniality, which are in the service of discrimination and exclusion. But for me, serious scientists do not work with imaginary creatures. If I may ask you, if you look at this image, what kind of a creature is this? It's an imaginary creature. I don't know what you would call it yourself. There is an element of a deer, and there's an element of a chicken. There's an element of, so different things put together to produce an imaginary creature. And this other image here I'm putting here, I don't know what you would call it, but it's a scary creature. It's a creature that makes you feel scared. You think this is going to eat me alive or something like that. These are imaginary creatures. So I'm using this as an analogy of how in education or language education, we follow the process of the creation of these imaginary creatures. But serious science for us must mean working with the real languages of the real people in their everyday real lives. And this is where the idea of translanguaging that Leketi is going to talk about comes in. You know, crossing, border crossing, and all of those kinds of things, how people use language in a day-to-day basis. So these are language practices of real people on a daily basis. So it must mean considering the totality of linguistic practices in our language education pedagogies. This precisely is precisely what our new book is about. We are trying to unsettle colonial histories and global inequalities that are packaged in notions of multilingualism that are based on, in one of my languages, isiZulu, isiNdebele, or isiXhosa, they use the same expression. We talk of what you call inunu zokwethusela abantwana. So the things that you use to scare children, you know, to say, if you don't do this, if you walk out at night, you're going to see this scary creature. So the languages that we are using in education, we are teaching in education, they are scary creatures that you are throwing out there because they are not the real language practices of people. And this is why they need to be decolonized, and we challenge that. So now, for this reason, then I'm saying here that language education or multilingual education is currently a colonial enterprise that proceeds by the route of the counting of these standard things, you know, these enumerable standard objects. So when we have an assemblage of all of these, you know, in a school setting, we tell ourselves that this is multilingual education. But it's not, because you are just pulling together diverse such standard things and pretend it's multilingual. But these are all products of a colonial model of understanding language, which proceeded through the processes of language policy and planning that we have said that are modeled along economic principles or colonial economic principles. But how do we say then languages, the things I'm critiquing here, are a legacy, are a legacy of colonial linguistics? Here is the point. Some scholars, you may know, I identify with some of these scholars here that have written a lot about colonial linguistics. People like Janina Brut-Griffler, Joseph Errington, and Fadon and Fanis, Sinfri Makoni, and Alistair Penikuko, Christine Severo, and Paul Tiambe Zeleza. They have written about the idea of colonial linguistics, which has three key underpinning pillars. The first one is that of Christian modernity. So the doctrinal and the prescriptive views on language traceable to Christian missionary interests that proceeded from biblical precepts about Jesus and Christianity as the only way. So I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, in John 14, verse 6. Now, these proselytizing currents run through language education discourses that rest on singular knowledge traditions, which in turn foreclose possibilities for multiple yet equally valid and legitimate ways of knowing. So there is a Christian modernity thread that runs through the way in which we teach languages and look at them in the context of education. The second one, a legacy of colonial linguistics, is that of ideologies of the modern nation state. So this is about the Euro-modernist catechism of one nation, one language, one people as the underpinning pillar of what Benedict Anderson characterizes as the imagined community. This is embedded again in language education, teaching languages as separate things that are connected to the nation state. And the third one is that of technologies of orthography and orthodoxy. So writing systems that have come crystallized into some kind of orthodoxy, or to a point of being misconstrued as true representation of speech forms. So when we see a language written down, often we make the erroneous mistake of thinking that it represents how people speak. And this is enforced through education. The linguistic purism that we find, the particular spelling systems and writing systems and all of those kinds of things that are often equated to how people speak. But all of these things arose at the service of the colonial project of domination, colonial project of control, colonial project of linguicide, and colonial project of exclusion. So the outcome then, in the context of Africa, the outcome has been what Ngugi wa Thiong'o calls linguistic encirclement. So being encircled linguistically. So here is the map of Africa that represents what happened when the African continent was partitioned on 15 November 1884, crossing over to 85 at Berlin. So the Berlin Conference did carve, it was a way of bringing about order in the scramble for Africa. The European powers are scrambling for different territories and resources and things like that. So they wanted to bring about order, in how to parcel themselves. As you can see on this map, the deep blue color there, those are territories that fell within for the French. So most of West Africa moving into a little bit of Central Africa. And then you had the British as well there, most of Southern Africa and part of some parts of Central going up North and West Africa as well. And you had Portuguese as well. Portuguese had very few, but the big ones were Angola here and Mozambique to the southeast. And you had Spain, you had Belgium. Belgium had a huge territory here, which is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, then at the time became the melting pot for experiments around linguistic encirclement and producing particular types of languages and things like that. So if you read Fadon and Fannis's work, they talk at length about how King Leopold, converted this part of Africa as his personal empire or fiefdom. And all the processes that took place there linguistically, they resulted in some kind of encirclement. Now, this is what Ngugi says about linguistic encirclement. He says, African languages were weaponized against Africans. Language was a weapon of war. Language was a very important element in both the conquest and maintenance of colonial rule, because it was likely to bind the minds of the middle class. So encirclement, there is a language, you are circled within that, and then control follows. So there is then what followed, the encirclement nomenclature or naming of places. So you talk of Anglophone Africa, Francophone Africa, Lusophone Africa, and so forth. So all of that is an encirclement that requires decolonization because it's unhelpful. Then, of course, we have the so-called African languages. Again, these were products of these processes of encircling, because they were produced or named in line with nation state or colonial state boundaries. So this is colonially inherited from a form of linguistic encirclement that is continuing even today. So what do I suggest as a solution to this challenge? I think what we need is frontier educational linguistics and frontier scholarship, which is looking at languages as interconnected patterns, frontiers, and scrambled systems, and not separate entities that are tied or connected to specific national territories, but they are frontiers, border crossing, fluidity, and all of those kinds of things, interconnections, and so forth. This is how we should look at languages. So now, Samuel Ndhlovu talks of this concept, the concept of the cognitive empire. That, well, there was the political empire in terms of occupation, in terms of the plunder and exploitation of resources and so forth. But there was also the cognitive empire. And it is the cognitive empire that still remains today. And how is the cognitive empire defined? So it is that form of imperialism which invades the mental universe of its victims, in the process imposing particular knowledge systems, displacing others, and consequently shaping the intellectual consciousness of its victims. So we operate in a cognitive empire. I am a product of the British imperial system of education. I would call it schooling, in fact, because looking back, I don't think that was education, it was schooling. So schooling essentially is about producing a particular type of citizenry that will be at the service of empire or the state. And this is what I received, you know, schooling, British schooling. But now I have educated myself outside of the system that was a schooling system, and I'm looking back from a critical perspective to say, okay, education is about critical reflection, you being able to reflect and to be able to connect different things together, knowledge traditions from different parts of the world, and not a tunnel vision that was produced or designed to be at the service of colonization and empire. So the cognitive empire is something that rests within our minds. And so if we are to advance the project of decolonization, what is required is for us to decolonize ourselves first. And when we talk of the British system of education or imperial education, we are not talking about people that have been gone to Britain or to the UK and had an education there. But we are talking about the British Empire. It's vast and it's continuing. It's there everywhere, you know. So that's the form of education or schooling that has been there. And the cognitive empire still remains because most of the time we are reproducing those forms of knowledge traditions. And what I'm saying here is that we need to decolonize ourselves first before we can reach out to trying to decolonize other people. So empire hasn't gone away. It is still firmly resident in our minds. Hence, Ngugi's call in this book, written 4 decades ago, Decolonizing the Mind, the Politics of Language in African Literature. That's precisely what he's saying, that we need to decolonize our minds. So now, it will be remiss for me to speak to a topic of this nature without referencing Alistair Pennycook and Sinfrey Makoni's 2020 book, Innovations and Challenges in Applied Linguistics from the Global South. They raise important points here that some of the things that we need to do in terms of decolonization and innovation in our field. One of the points they raise is that assumptions about existence of languages or multilingualisms as numerable entities are false and they need to be challenged and decolonized. They also talk about the monolingual mindset here that we are using to frame. Often we frame multilingualism from a monolingual perspective, the counting of multiple such entities, and then we call them multilingualism. But their argument is that we need to move away from a universalizing multilingualism to a context-specific notion of multilingualisms So that multilingualism is understood differently in different contexts, in different societies, in different cultures, and in different traditions. So this is how we should be looking at the idea of multilingualism. And that's the call we are answering in this book, which I will touch on a little bit. Maybe I might skip this part here, the work of Patrick Chabal, which is quite interesting because Patrick Chabal was a scholar who was advancing Western forms of knowledge for a very long time. But before he died, 2 years before he died, he wrote this book titled The End of Conceit. And in this book, he is actually pointing us to the omissions and blind spots of the modern Western scientific tradition. And some of the things he says include the following, that Western scientific thought is built upon and thrives on conceit. So conceit is about hiding things and pushing forward falsehoods and lies and project them as representing the way we all know. Such conceit includes, but is not limited to, the following. So devaluing other non-Western knowledge systems in order to justify the singular existence of Western thought and so on. So that's the conceit which Patrick Chabal talks about in this book. Now he says that there are a few things that we need to do. One of them is that we need to think, theorize, and learn with or from communities of the Global South. The other point is that we need to recognize and value diverse geographies of knowledge about languages and language education beyond the Euromodernist tradition of knowing. And that we need to collaborate. This is an important point. We need to collaborate with scholars immersed in the Global South as a key to decolonizing, not a situation where Northern scholars and institutions are sides or for decolonial agenda setting. So, like, I'm located in the in a country that fits within the Northern tradition, really, though it's in the South. And other people as well, like you are in Canada, you are in the US, you are in the UK, and you set the agenda for decolonization based in that part of the world. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But I think the important thing is to then collaborate with the scholars that are located in the Global South, where the effects of colonization are still ongoing and people are feeling it and living it every day. And not the other way around, where institutions of the Global North are appropriating and setting the agenda for decolonization. That is subversion, in my view. And I think we need to be able to get to a point where we open up to collaborating with scholars and communities that are located in the Global South, rather than bringing the agenda setting to where we are, as it were. So we need to seek out and value other traditions of knowing, pre-colonial especially, libraries and archives of the South that survived colonial domination, because not everything was decimated by the cognitive empire. There are some pre-colonial libraries and archives of knowledge that we need to tape into. Okay, so one of the key points that Patrick Chabal says here is that the 19th century colonial order and the methodologies that were developed at the time, they are no longer fit for the job because they are both historically and conceptually out of date. They were developed to serve the interests of advancing the empire, of advancing colonization. And so those methodologies and theories, they cannot help us to solve the question of decolonizing. So it will be remiss for us to think that, it will be really folly for us to think that we can use the same tools that were advancing colonization to advance decolonization. It doesn't work. So we need to rethink afresh. So thinking from a non-European standpoint will enable us to question a number of assumptions that we take for granted. All right, so it is our thinking we must change if we are to approach these questions fruitfully. Okay, so how are we thinking otherwise with Ndhlovu and Makalela? So me and Leketi, we are trying to think otherwise here. in this particular book. So some of you have the copy of the book, and this is the outline of the book, where the chapters there: Myths We Live By, Multilingualism, Colonial Invasions, Unsettling Colonial Roots of Multilingualism, and so forth. So we have 9 chapters there. We conclude with a chapter on recentering silenced lingualisms and voices. So we are trying to think otherwise here. These are the questions we address. I'm not going to go read them one by one for the sake of time. But I will touch a little bit on some of the contributions to theory, methods, and policy and praxis that we bring. The first one is that, of course, it's about thinking otherwise, thinking in a different way. So a new discourse, new grammars, and new vocabularies we can use to advance the ongoing global decolonial movement in education and in the community. So we are searching for epistemic reconstitution of multilingualism through positing the following 3 key concepts: the concept of coloniality of language, the concept of language of the people, and the concept of socially realistic multilingualism. These are the 3 key concepts that we are introducing in this book as a way of advancing the decolonial project in language and literacy education. So I will conclude with this. Some of you might be familiar with this metaphor here. The story of 6 blind men that touched different parts of an elephant. And one man touched the trunk of an elephant, the long thing that is part of the mouth. And he thought, well, an elephant is like a snake. And someone touched the ear of an elephant and said, well, an elephant, I think it's like a blanket. It's a big thing, like a blanket of sorts. And another blind man touched the side of an elephant and thought, well, an elephant is like a wall. It's like a wall. That's what it's like. Another one touched the tusk or the horn of an elephant and said, maybe it's like a spear, because they touched that part. And the other person touched the tail of an elephant and thought, well, I think an elephant is like a rope, because they touched the tail. So the point here is that none of these 6 men is necessarily wrong. Yet none of them give us a complete picture either. Each account is a partial description. So only in their totality do they tell us what an elephant looks like. And I think such is the enterprise of knowledge production when seen through the lens of decoloniality. It is through collaboration, cooperation, co-production, and not competition that we are able to come up with a better understanding of the complete picture. So languages, then, these are things that are interconnected and not seen as individual countable entities, but there is interconnection. And when we do research then as researchers, I think it is important for us to embrace this idea of frontier scholarship, or what Francis Nyamjo calls convivial scholarship. So convivial scholarship really is about connecting with people who are doing work from different traditions, different communities, and learning from one another in a bigger project of co-creating alternative solutions to the challenges we face in language and literacy education. So that's my time, and I will leave it here and hand over to Leketi. And thanks everyone for listening. I hope I didn't talk for too long. Are we there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. I was saying that before anything, I have to apologize for my internet connection. You saw what happened, right? But I was saying right now that as I listen to you, and also by reading your text, yours and Leketi, obviously, it's like a refreshing for us. For thinking that we've been questioning and all new ideas that really inspire us, right? We just have to thank you very much for your presentation so far. And now we are going to have our friend, also Professor Leketi Makalela. Okay, so Leketi, please, you are really welcome to share your ideas with us. Okay, here he is, and the floor is yours. I think, Professor, excuse me, I think your microphone is off. Your microphone? It's mute. It's still mute. Hmm. Um, I think, look, and the screen, Professor, now I think it's okay. Now it's not.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, now it's okay. That's okay.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
fine.
Perfect. Let me try share my screen. My presentation is right over there. Can you see my screen?
Not yet. I can see it.
Can you see it now?
No. It's still, yeah, nothing has appeared so far. Now, yes, it's starting.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, now it's starting.
Okay.
So you're welcome,
Thank
and
you.
the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. And let me see if I can move the slide. Um,
Okay.
can you see?
Yes. Yes.
Thank
It's
you
full
so
screen.
much. Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity to speak here, and thanks to my friend and colleague Finex for the amazing presentation he made already. He made the job quite easy for me, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank him so much also in the writing of the book, because he did more than 80% of the work in this. I want to acknowledge him publicly and thank him for being such an amazing, wonderful scholar. There are bears around me. I hope they're not interrupting. So what I wanted to do, our agreement was that I'll deal more with the practical work and then leave the theoretical stuff more to him, which he did amazingly well. So I'm going to look at decolonizing relating to the book. Oops, I probably need to move here. I'm under attack. Okay. So we did this book on decolonizing multilingualism. And I'm very, very pleased that we're able to send the message, and it's a book that is getting the recognition that it needs, because oftentimes when you talk about multilingualism, it's assumed to be an antonym for monolingualism. Therefore, if you're multilingual, you're necessarily okay, and that is a decolonized monolingualism. But that's not quite the same. There are different kinds of multilingualisms, and we are probably somehow perpetuating the multilingualism that was not supposed to serve Africa for its own socio-economic development. Because of that, you hear a lot of talk about South Africa being the highly a country that leverages on its multilingualism. It has got 12 official languages, a story that is really being celebrated in the world. But when you take a critical look at what that means, you'd see that it's actually enumeration of languages according to Western colonial norms. Basically, it's a perpetuation of, you may have 100 languages as official, but as long as it's not the right type of multilingualism that is community bound, then you are still very colonial. So we have got policies in Africa that, show to be a bit multilingual, but in reality, they are still perpetuating the same colonial constructs. I'm inspired by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, people without history or culture become mimics who have placed their memories in a psychic tomb. Because the question we have here now is, how do we know that the type of multilingualism we have is not relevant to our local communities? We need to dig back into the past and know where we come from. Thabo Mbeki, pioneering the idea of the African Renaissance, quoted here by Koza, who says we have to meet prevailing global challenges from within our worldview and proceed to action from our own authentic possibilities based on the culture and competencies of African themselves. And of course, the question is the multilingualism that is being perceived, that is put in policies in African context, the right type of multilingualism Africans should be having? Finex have already talked at length about that. We know the answer is no, which is why multilingualism does not serve Africa's development agenda. As it is. We and Finex and myself had the privilege to be in these two cities on several occasions. When you are in New York, you hear all kinds of languages that you'd have anywhere in the world. Practically all languages of the world can be heard in the streets of New York. But often what you hear there is a speaker of a particular language speaking to a speaker of exactly the same language, maybe through the phone or through the mic, and it is not really, it's very, very horizontal, but multilingual. But I mean to say vertical rather. When you are in the streets of Johannesburg, you see something different, something that includes, of course, your New York reality, but here in Johannesburg, far much more complex in that there's an overlap, there's a fluidity. So a speaker of one language speaking to speaker of another language, and the responses cross-pollinating without any borders. This is the language without borders that Finex spoke about. Now, when you think about these multilingualisms, one is very much vertical in orientation, and the other one is horizontal in orientation. Far more complex than that is that in Johannesburg, you see more of the horizontal, of course, embedded within the vertical and vice versa. That's the real complex multilinguality, which none of the policies in Africa are able to capture or in the world today. The big issue, if you go to the practical situation here, is that multilingual and epistemic biases are a pandemic, really huge pandemic that are against academic success and access in sub-Saharan Africa. There was a need, therefore, to decolonize, to change. Multilingual students are disadvantaged and marginalized. Their epistemic access, their identity positions questioned through the education system. We are working against the United Nations Development Goals and Africa's 2063 agenda, what we call the Africa we want. They all converge on one pillar: quality education. You will not have quality education. You'll have schooling, as Finex said, not education, if the education that you receive is not mediated through ways of knowing that are local to the people. Education also should be sense-making, about to know and to be, your epistemological pathways and the nature of who you are. There's a Greek philosopher who said, those who master the curriculum basically master themselves. That means you grow within the remit of who you are. But can we say the same about many African or countries in the global south, that they are growing within the remit of who they are? It is a non-sense-making project for Africa, if you think about education. Have therefore notions of de-education, miseducation, which are all embedded in what is called schooling today. How do we know this? The literacy trajectory so that our children in many African countries come to school a little bit smarter, but over time they become stupefied throughout their schooling system. And the grade 4 slump, which is universal, however, much more pronounced here in between grade 3 and grade 4, is so huge. Paul Freire reminds us when they go to high school and the university level, where the throughput rate is about 15% in some other years, he speaks about unauthentic forms of existence and thought. That is huge. And that's because of the language factor. I just want to stress, Finex have already mentioned this. I'll skip through very quickly. The oneness ideology in our teacher education, where multilingualism is misconceived as multiple monolingualisms, or what is referred to as monolingual multilingualism, versus, as we'll hear later, multilingual multilingualism, or even something far much more complex, monolingual multilingualism. Multilingual multilingualism, rather. There's still this ancient mistaken belief that if you use more than one language, it will create more mental confusion, which is a colonial construct. The story of Ipsiety versus the European Enlightenment, this is the beginning stage. We spoke about that idea of developing nations on the basis of one language being cascaded and transported expanded into Africa through that Balkanization. I'll skip that slide again, but there are two main frameworks for education. Really, it's about the cognitive efficiency mechanism that believe that you have a brain system that is very linear, that can only take one thing at a time and not multitask, so to say. And when that doesn't work, which is really what is not working today, is the fact that we now go into another hypothesis, the environmental opportunity hypothesis, where we say, well, give them more books, give them more classrooms, give them more time. We believe that more is better. But when more, if it's not grounded on the foundations of ways of knowing of the people, it's never better. It makes the situation even worse. So it's not about the quantity, it's about the fundamentals. Here is a model that I believe, of course, conceived from a monolingual lens about one language operating in that way. I'll show in a second some of the issues about colonialism within the language typology, what is called versioning. When you teach many African languages, for example, you use the logic of English to teach. Because this is how we are told, without realizing that they are very much different. The emphasis in literacy is on phonemic awareness. Many teachers are asked to start to teach phonemically, even for languages that do not require that have got rich morphological repertoires that are not even part of the curriculum. Okay, and it makes sense in English, for example, to emphasize this sounding, the phonological awareness, where your phonemes such as S in word like dog, if you want to make plural, it is realized, although it's as we all see it, but it's realized very differently, as in cats, dogs, and horses. So the pronunciation differs. The only way, because English is not orthographically transparent, you have to do more of the phonemic awareness. But when you transport that into African other languages, it gets messy. And the only way to recognize and see all these differences is if you actually teach these languages multilingually rather than monolingually. Another thing is there is this Babe Bibo Bu methodology in many African languages for languages that have got syllabic integrity. Okay, in other words, no one syllable is complete without the other. But if you use the syllabic system or the logic from English you want to teach from monosyllables, for example, if you say eat, walk, run, go, these are all monosyllabic words in English, and they make a lot of sense. There's meaning embedded in there. But in African languages, the V means nothing, for example. So children are barking at texts. That's part of the colonial package, that they are learning to read and to write, but nonsensical and what you call nonsense words. So it's backing at texts, the methodologies that are used in there. Therefore, there's a lot of read aloud. There's more of the oral reading fluency versus comprehension, and there isn't really much about the comprehension part. I will speak about the paragraph because there's also a need to decolonize paragraph, maximum of straight to the point. When you write a paragraph, reading and writing comes down to a paragraph eventually. But what does that mean is that that particular way of making sense universal. Okay, you have got languages that are so-called reader responsible versus languages that are writer responsible. Speed is often in assessments such as EGRA, early grade reading assessments, where speed is really very much encouraged, which is contravenes the cultural construct in many African languages, ways of making sense that do not necessarily need speed. The big five, as in the big five animals, in reading literacy as well, there's what you call the big five, but these are not universal. They are push on to other languages. This is linguicize, so it's a distraction of literacy from developing in languages other than Western, mainly in this case, English. Paul Freire also speak about preaching in the desert. That's what teachers are doing with the kids. They're doing za, nze, nzi, zo, zu, the sounds that don't make any sense. And we call that literacy. Actually, the right formulation for that is literacy, and the backing of texts, which do not lead to meaning-based type of learning. Now, the question Finex spoke already about, what we are doing in the book is to try to find answers, the silent voices. So how do we know that what we think is what we should be doing? Then we need to change the lens of finding. He spoke about already the archives and all of materials that can be looked into in order to, in the decolonization project. But we do have got elders. I've been involved with a lot of work where the elders in communities, remote rural areas of South Africa, Mpumalanga, Limpopo in particular, where we look at the elders as the beacons of hope so that we can get into ways of knowing as they were passed on from generation to generation. So they become both the researchers. The overlap begins there in our finding of knowledge as the researchers and the researched, where we are not researching on them, but we are researching with them. Because of that, you'll see in the book we are developing an idea that we might have a local or global South-based research type of a methodology, which is not, which is different from the type of methods that we do. So that is work in progress, but we are happy with the findings so far around what it might look like. So if you read, I think chapter 4 of the book would speak about Ubuntu research methodology or framework. Data collection, and the only way you can get to this is it allows for multilingual engagement if you research with the communities. But if you do that on them, it only allows for, well, using of English as the language of research, that is being decolonized as we work and allow multiple languages to multiple truths through multiple languages. Data analysis becomes communal, repetitive, and quite a negotiated process. It's quite lengthy, but it's very much qualitative. Well, I'm coming back to the idea of a paragraph. I don't know if this would make sense too, but the idea is that there are ways of reading and writing the world that are differentiated. Well, in the logic of the paragraph as it stands, it says you have got a paragraph, you have got a topic sentence, and from the topic sentence, you have got supporting sentences, and then a concluding sentence. So it's a three-way step, which is based on the maxim of straight to the point. The minute you say topic sentence, it means you start with the main idea first. That is the locus of maxim of straight to the point. This level of directness, it is very different from the locus of indirection in African ways of making sense, where we don't go straight to the point, but we make sense through inferences, for example. Now, when the children go to school and they are taught only in one language and they have to write a paragraph only in one language, it is what we call cultural violence, because that contravenes their ways of knowing. And the danger here is the teachers not being aware that they're actually involved in the colonizing project rather. So African languages mainly would use what you call, that's what we find from the elderly communities, this idea of circumlocution, okay, where you don't go straight to the point and you use inferences. It is a reader responsible language because you are dialectic, you are more in chorus or in conversation. So the reader has to infer and get sense because the speaker doesn't give all the information, so that there is a actual dialogue. But the paragraph in English is a very much writer responsible language. It's the duty of the writer to make themselves clear. As long as they themselves are clear, the reader will figure it out. So it's not about the reader, it's about the writer. That's the point I wanted to make. So these are some of the different epistemological pathways, ways of coming to know, understanding, and reading the world that are different. As long as we are not thinking about what something, paragraph is everything in literacy, because this is what we read, and when we assess students, this is what we write. So it is a huge challenge, really, a project of decolonization. I've already mentioned this, that there's a need to begin to value some of these voices, ways of knowing, where the textual coherence for African languages, for example, is external to the paragraph, whereas in English, it is internal to the paragraph. Here, in the African language context, you need to go around, because that's the circumlocution. You need to go around, you call it going around and in circle in order to get the meaning, but not necessarily from what I'm saying. Very cognitively demanding, you could even say. Because of these monolingual ways of teaching and serious neglect of African languages and their epistemic pathways, there's a need to shift and go into the translingual mode from fixity to fluidity. We focus now on what people do with language and not what languages look like, the structure. I will skip quickly in the interest of time, but the idea of translanguaging had been misunderstood, and of course there's a paradox. How can you talk about languages and at the same time not recognize the same languages that you're talking about? The point of the matter is there has been a debate also in the field, as some of you might know. Well, Chomsky's ways that you have got a language internal to you, which is your internal repertoire or your idiolect, so to say, versus the external language, what you call socially named language, such as isiZulu and all of that. These are different parameters. So translanguaging says, first and foremost, is very much speaker oriented. It's about what speaker means rather than what the the hearer hears. Of course, it says also recognizes that there is a hearer out there who hears a different language, which may not necessarily, different languages, which from the speaker's point of view, when they make meaning, those differences or the boundaries are not clearly delineated. Okay. Maybe if there's a question. Also, we have got Sankofa. I spoke about the elderly, but this Ghanaian metaphor is always bird. It's always very interesting for us to decolonize. It means going back to fetch as we move forward into the 21st, 22nd century. We are stretching forward, but going before the colonial project started. That's the best methodology for decolonizing. Because of some of the work we have done was to look at the ancient city of Mapungwe in Limpopo in South Africa, where we have sayings in our African languages where we say, stranger come to our place so we are complete. That's where the Ubuntu logic, I am because we are. And if you compare that with the, I think therefore I am, or if you go to Rome, you do what the Romans do, which is very much about, so it's completion versus incompletion on the other side. From here, we are able to theorize. I won't spend time on this because there's also the UnB, which is in your country and in Southern America, where the connection between people and the environment is quite very big. We don't make the distinction, the overlap. And the people in the southern, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, them being bounded, I am because you are. So these are some of the global South constructs that can be used to decolonize multilingualism and education broadly. Okay, I'll skip this in the interest of time. I'm just explaining the concept of Ubuntu translanguaging, how it came into existence, the humanizing part of a language, that there's no one language that is complete without the other. And as I explain, if you go deeper into the languages, you'll see that no one syllable is complete without the other. So this idea of incompletion and interdependence or discontinuous continuation, which is very much disruptive of order, but at the same time, we recreate new ones when we communicate. In other words, there is a language and not a language at the same time. The confluence, the speaker, I've already spoken about the paradox. I'll skip over that. We do multilingual tutorials where we try to do a lot of translanguaging work at VETS, for example. Okay. All right. So that was a clip. There's so much into that, but I just wanted you to hear some of the work that we do. African languages being used simultaneously, well, between themselves and between those African languages and English. I like what Baker said here, that with translanguaging, it allows for deeper digestion of content. It's not just simple copying. More than one language, no one language is complete without the other. What are the implications for literacy and decolonization? The value of community-based knowledge is key. Multilingualism or translanguaging as an anchor for knowledge making, the horizontal multilingualism that we are speaking about, or multilingualism as we spoke about, and also leveraging that everything in the universe lives. That is an IKS knowledge system, indigenous knowledge system that lives in many African societies. So literacy is an event where reading, the object, the idea of the act of reading and writing are simply props, but not ends in themselves, props of an actual social event where someone is making meaning. You are reading the text, you're talking to somebody and hearing that text. You wish then literacy could go into that, especially if this is done multilingually. There are a lot of implications for the school from this talk, from this book in particular, that I'll skip. But in conclusion, we do argue in the book in many several spaces that monolingual multilingualism and epistemic biases undermine African ways of knowing, acting, and being, and they do advance Western forms of literacy. I also cite Finex in the presentation today, Western forms of knowledge that are being perpetuated by monolingual multilingualism. There's a need, therefore, to decolonize. And when we decolonize multilingualism, we are resuscitating the multilingual souls from spiritual emptiness, economic disenfranchisement, and educational marginalization, work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Ndhlovu from epistemicide. And the work that Finex and myself, we're talking about cultural violence, as you saw in the idea of a paragraph. On this note, I want to thank you so much and allow time for conversations, if any. Thank you.
Leketi, we are the ones who really thank you for your wonderful speech, right? We can see there, I don't know if you've been following, but everybody, we can read many comments like, thank you for the explanations and for the provocative thoughts. We are really glad for that. Right. Well, we have some questions and also we have some thoughts, as I mentioned. Right. There is the one from our friend, Professor Rajagopalan. Right. And he says something very interesting. He says, our erstwhile colonizers, we should actually start by effectively promoting a discharacterization of the very language and its I'm getting quite blind. Highfalutin norms, mulling it, mutilating it, mangling it. It's a kind of a provocative thought, right, that we really need to do. The more we think of language that is so close to us, sometimes I think that people try to get us apart from our own language. What do you think about that? Can you read it? Mine is small. That's a provocative. There is another one, Lauro, from our professor Rajagopalan. Okay, Finex, I think Finex is also there. Okay.
Did you want us to speak to any one of these, or because I was going to speak to what Professor Raja has said. Do you want me to speak to that?
Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Raja. Yeah, it's nice to have you here. Yes, you are right. The process of mutilation. You might be familiar with the work of Sinfri Makoni and Alistair Pennycook, going back 2007, I think. They talk about the project of disinvention and reconstitution. So disinventing languages and reconstituting them afresh. That's precisely the point, that pull everything apart. You know, it's radical, but it's necessary. It's a necessary agenda to pull everything apart and rebuild afresh. So that is needed, because if we can't pull things apart, there is no way we can start afresh, because we will continue to sticking with what we have. So I think you are right. I totally agree with you there.
Yes,
and of course, this one is a comment, and I agree that it can be, yes. Absolutely, and translanguaging is doing exactly that now. At least it gives us space to have conversation and to challenge pedagogies, to challenge the very notion of a language, where we see language as doing rather than just a thing.
Apart from us. Okay, Lauro, can you put that we have a question? Can you put in the screen a question or both? The first question. Now, okay, I think it's there. We have a question number one that I think it's very interesting for a discussion. Just a minute. Okay. As you can see, we have there in Portuguese because of our audience, right? But also in English. And then the first question for the audience we have: how does a decolonial and multilingual perspective deal with the conflicts and the demands of a global and local order? So we have two questions in one. Should we And if so, in which ways we should embrace in language policies the demands of a global order, hegemonic languages, and the demands of a local order, minoritized languages?
Well,
You may feel free. If either you, Leketi or Phoenix, you can start.
well, the Phoenix will finish up the response, but let me start. I like the actual the idea of a global order, okay? Because what we are doing is to try to say, in fact, there isn't such an order. So there should be no conflict as far as we are aware, because that conflict is exactly what has been we were made to believe, for example, that you have got multiple so many languages. Nigeria has got 700 400 languages. In South Africa you have so many languages. Because of that, then you are not able, therefore you need some kind of an order that is coming up from the north, a language of wider communication, so to say. We don't believe so. We don't think, first of all, that from a decolonial and multilingual perspective, we are going beyond what is considered or seen as conflicts. The 11 official languages in South Africa, you'd argue that, well, we can't do that because there's so many. But we say, no, we don't have. People are using all those languages at the same time. In fact, from the logic of Ubuntu, I can be I, the I and the we says to us that we are beyond ourselves, but we are also part of the global good. So there's no conflict from my position.
The conflict is built for us. The conflict then is built from outside. It's people who create the conflict. They say that
yes, the conflict is internally created. Yes, of course. And once we begin to believe that, but I'll leave that to Finance, who is an expert on this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks. This is an interesting question, and I'm happy to speak to it. Thanks for asking the question. Maybe the starting point is that I don't think I would characterize this situation between the global and the local as a situation of conflict. I think looking at it from that angle betrays a Eurocentric colonial way of thinking, because we always, from that way of thinking, we think we see differences and we don't pay attention to what we call the paradigm of similarity. So now, the global and the local, for me, they are in complementary existence. They complement one another. There is no global without the local. So these two things are not in conflict. They are complementary to one another. So this is where I think I would go to a social anthropologist, Francis Nyamjo from the University of Cape Town's idea of ontologies of incompleteness. That there is no such thing as completeness, whether you are talking about things or human beings or social realities or cultures, you name it. Everything is incomplete on its own, and it needs others to be complete. So the global and the local, they are not necessarily in conflict. There may be a tension of sorts, perceptions about tension, but they are not in conflict. So I think we need to talk about interconnections, complementarities, as it were. So when it comes to languages, then my thinking is that what we need in this kind of a scenario is the idea of socio-linguistic justice, to understand that there is no one language that will do everything in every context. So some language may be seen as prestigious in a particular context. That's okay. But in another context, it's not as prestigious. I will give you a quick story. I said in my talk that I think we need to relearn to tell good stories. I will tell you a short story here, just to illustrate this particular point. When I go to the rural village where I grew up in, Now, the thinking is that English is a global language, is a prestigious language. That's the thinking, But if I go to my local village today and start speaking to everybody in English, I am frowned upon. People say, "What's wrong with you? Can you stop speaking this stupid language? We don't want you to hear you speaking that thing. Can you speak the local?" It's a minority, tiny language, but it has prestige at the local level. So this is precisely the point, that every variety, every language has its place, has its space. So it's not competition, but it's about how we use the resources appropriately in the context to which they can be used, to communicate, in an acceptable way, culturally acceptable way, and so forth. So I don't see tensions and competition here, but I see complementarity of roles, But it's a Euro-modernist colonial way of thinking that comes with the idea of competition, because it's a duality. They look at things, in binary mode, to say this compared to that, this compared to that. And they don't emphasize the idea of interconnections, and incompleteness. So from a decolonial perspective, I think, and multilingual perspective, what we are dealing with here are connections and complementarities, and not conflicts or tensions. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Excellent, excellent. So this it might be kind of a practical question, maybe, but when we think of language policies, then we should be embracing this perspective. Sometimes we think it's difficult for us to think of it, because I think it was Diogenes, our friend Diogenes is also a professor that we have here in Brazil, and he mentioned something interesting in our chat. He mentioned that we have to really decolonize, and maybe it's exactly because decolonize completely our mind and our perspective of language. Otherwise, we are going to just reproduce the language policies that we are used to, right? This idea, and sometimes I think the problematic part is for us to understand that there is this complete uncompleteness, right? And the transition between one language and the other is the natural part. It's the natural thing, right? Okay, very good.
So can I add something there, Ostias, that you talk of language policy? I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of language policy from a decolonial perspective? So if we look at language policy the way it is right now, which is connected to the colonial project, and try to speak to it from that angle, then we won't resolve the matter. Because if we look at it from a colonial perspective, it's hard to imagine an alternative. Because the colonial project, like I gave in one of the slides there, where I indicated that it's the economic modeling, the neoclassical economic principles, they are the ones that are driving, how language policies are made. It's because there is the particular agenda that is colonial. So what we need to do is to rethink, what do we need language policies for? All right. What do we want them to serve? If they are to serve a colonial order, then we keep things the way they are. But if we want to serve a different purpose, which is decolonial, pull everything apart and say, what do we want out of this? All right. Yeah. So, because you see, in the communities where I come from, where Leketi comes from, people are using languages, without necessarily saying, okay, now I have to separate this from that. I have to, this one is more important than the other. They are using resources that are available. They're in the communities. Okay. So if people are using languages that way, why then are we then getting to the school context? We want them to use languages in this particular constrained way. So Ingrid Pillar, a colleague of mine here at Macquarie University here in Australia, she introduces the concept of what she calls non-languages and non-places and non-things. So it's things that we say they are languages, but they are only limited to places that you will not find in real lived experiences of people. So it's languages for alienation, languages that disconnect people from their culture, from their tradition, from their way of life, because they are only limited to the school context. When they come out of school, they go into the community, it's something else. Those things we teach as languages in schools, they are non-languages because they belong to non-places. A school is a non-place because it's constrained, it's far removed, it's an ivory tower, if I may use that word. It's not really connected to everyday lived experiences of people. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board, learn afresh with communities, and co-create a new knowledge about language policy, new pathways, alternative pathways. I know it's a huge task, because you are fighting against a system that has been there for over 500 years. All right, we need to face this reality. It's a world that is imagined in a particular way. But the problem we face is that oftentimes we tend to think that these things are of a natural kind. They've always been like that. But they are imagined, they were created social constructions. All right. So we can reconstruct something new. If these things were constructed, what is stopping us from constructing something different? All right. So I think that's the point. We often choose the lazy and convenient path of following and embracing what was invented by others. And we think that it is impossible to imagine a different kind of world, but it is. We need to get out of that, decolonize ourselves first, and then start thinking afresh.
Excellent. It has very much to do to what you said in the beginning. There is a planning language. It's planning inequality. You mentioned that and really caught my attention in the beginning of your talk of today. Okay, very good. I tried to advance, and my question was actually I tried to advance some other questions because I don't know if we have time for all of them, but I tried to advance, and some of them I think you really answered them. But then we have another one. The question number one it was answered, and then we have Brazil is part of a group of countries marked by colonial inheritance, and the Portuguese language being the element of such inheritance. How is it possible to decolonize colonial languages such as the Brazilian Portuguese? Maybe you could talk. Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Leketi?
I always want to eat first. But Finex, you made a good point about the language policy issue, about decolonizing the language policy itself. What purpose does it serve? And then the key point is, if you have got a language policy now, is that it has to do this intercomplementarity or the incompletion that must be embedded within what you call a language policy. Because the status planning, corpus planning were monolingual in their orientation, then we need to see something outside of that. So the Brazilian Portuguese is evolved from Portuguese. I would imagine that Brazilian Portuguese it includes local varieties or local languages that are actually embedded. One way is still the same for us, is how is Portuguese in Brazil related? What is the interface between the Brazilian Portuguese and the local indigenous languages and local ways of knowing? That is, for me, the way that you can go back. We have got just like English in what we call the third world, expanding circles, or not expanding circles, the Kakuyan circles of English. So exactly. So creative multilingualism within the Brazilian Portuguese is a way for me to decolonize, take it, so that what we have called Brazilian Portuguese is not exactly a mirror of the Portuguese from Portugal. And I believe that is not. It's about leveraging on the locality of it and standing it on the ground. Okay.
Yeah. Perfect.
Thank you. Bye.
Finex, would you add?
Yeah. Thanks, Leketi. And I was going to say something along those lines, but let me start by referencing again a colleague of mine. Alistair Pennycook wrote a book in 2010 titled "Language as Local Practice." So language is a local practice, and Brazilian Portuguese, I would imagine, is a local practice. So let's look at the locality of a Brazilian Portuguese. What are the local nuances of Brazilian Portuguese, and what role do they play? So it may have evolved as a consequence of the instrumentalization of language for purposes of colonization, exploitation, and oppression. So now what I often say is that now, if colonialists were able to instrumentalize their own languages first and also local languages for the wrong ends, we need to invert that. Invert that and instrumentalize the languages for good. So use them then for purposes of empowering people. You know, Brazilian Portuguese can be used for the good ends. So it's about looking at what it is that we can gain in terms of social and cognitive justice, because it will be folly for us to say, well, colonial languages have no place anymore in our countries because they came with colonization. They still have a place. It's about trying to remove or get rid of the colonial baggage that they came with and use them for developmental purposes, you know, for social justice and pushing those agendas. That's what we need to do. So it's appropriating. I mean, it's there. It's a language that is there in the linguistic landscape of Brazil, and we can't say, well, we don't need it here anymore. I think that will be a thinking which is against decolonization, because decolonial thought says everything does matter. Everything does matter, but it's about how you use it. And yet the colonial model of looking at things says what matters is the colonial approach or the imperial body of thought. That's what matters. So it's totalizing, it's universalizing, it's erasing. But you see, when we look at things from a translanguaging perspective and from a decolonial perspective, we are saying all bodies of thought, all resources matter, and they need to be put on the table of ideas or an arsenal of tools that we can use to achieve different ends. All right. So what we can do with Brazilian Portuguese, with the South African Afrikaans, is to to remove the kind of an oppressive element that the language has been used for and use it for other ends, for ends of empowerment, you know? Yeah, because the colonizers used the languages. Like, I mean, in South Africa, for example, you know, even African languages, for heaven's sake, the Bantustans and the Bantu language policies, Bantu education that was there from 1948 when apartheid kicked in, they promoted African languages, they promoted isiZulu, isiXhosa, you know, Setswana, as instruments of oppression, all right? Because they wanted to separate for segregation. It was like they are promoting these languages, but they were instrumentalizing them for purposes of oppression. So let's just invert that and do the things the other way around and turn it around, flip the thing around and use them for greater good.
Excellent. Just to let you know, we have some more 7 questions. Okay, Finex, we are kind of worried about your time over there because you are really almost 12 hours ahead, almost midnight for everybody to know. But we have another question there. That's why I'm going a little faster, because to respect the different time zones, right? So when question number 3, we have, how does the multilingual perspective advocated in the book could be useful for the Brazilian social reality and its particularities? Could you exemplify? Maybe we also had a glimpse of how you could answer that, but feel free.
Okay, I'll start. You know, the multilingual perspective we have, we believe that would apply to the global South broadly, but the specifics of Brazil those particularities, I think we can really speak about the principle. We speak about, in my talk, I highlighted the idea of horizontal multilingualism, the multilingualism that is overlapping between. In fact, the previous question that spoke about the local languages versus the Brazilian Portuguese, for example. So you have got Brazilian Portuguese, you have got local languages, but the rhetorical organization, epistemic pathways that are within the Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, could and should be related very closely to the local ways of knowing. So here is about epistemological transformation rather than at the really face level. I think we get deeper to say when we speak, how we speak, and how do we make sense. In Brazil, multilingual, and multilingual doesn't mean only the surface, what we hear me as a language, but the deeper stuff about pathways of knowing, how do we make sense, and how we become. And we embed that because we are saying so far Brazil, like South Africa, has adopted multilingualism from colonial masters. And because of this, we see languages in Brazil as very much differentiated. There's a need for this overlap and fluidity, basically.
Okay, excellent.
I will add a few points. There are a few comments. Thanks, Leketi, for speaking to that. A few additional points, really. Maybe I'll go to the point that I raised in my presentation about languages of the people as opposed to languages of the state. And I would imagine in Brazil, there is lots of indigenous languages or local languages, which I would call languages of the people. So the arguments we advance here on this framework of multilingualism can be a template to say, okay, if we look at the idea of languages of the people, which languages in Brazil, how can we leverage them, to connect with the social realities and the particularities of the context? We also introduced the concept in the book of ignored lingualisms. That is in chapter 9, I think, the closing chapter, ignored lingualisms, which are the practices, people's language practices that are ignored, conveniently ignored, set aside and left alone. There is plenty of those, I would imagine, in Brazilian society. So the concept of ignored lingualism can be used as an operationalization framework to say, how do we pick up all these varieties that are not treated seriously, taken seriously? They are seen as they don't matter, all right? And they are ignored and marginalized, right? So that concept, I think, will also apply in the context of Brazil. For example, you say you have street languages, for example, languages that are used by the youth, for example, all of those. How do we leverage them so that they connect with people's everyday practices? So it's those kinds of concepts, I think. And so what we present in this book is a framework for the global South, which can be interpreted and applied differently in different contexts, because we want to shy away from, we don't want to claim universal application and relevance of the ideas we are putting forward here. Because as soon as we claim that, what we are doing is falling back into the mode of the Western mode or the colonial way of thinking that every concept will apply neatly in every context. You look at the context first. What is it that applies? Some concepts may not neatly apply, and that's okay, because the context is different. The traditions are different. The people are different. The cultures are different. Ways of life are different, and all of those kinds of things. So it's picking those bits and pieces of things that would apply and be relevant to the local context.
Perfect. And this, I think, this next question is goes straight to exactly what you were saying, Finex. As you are, and for both of you, obviously, but we have here, as you are in very different countries. Leketi is in South Africa in Johannesburg, and Finex is in Sydney, Australia, right, Finex?
Yeah.
And the question is, as you are in very different countries and realities, could you tell us a little bit of the main difficulties or challenges you have faced, or you faced, or you have faced in trying to implement a multilingual perspective for language learners or users? Could you exemplify, bring us the main difficulties that you have faced so far? I believe that
It's
there are
the
many.
teacher. Yeah, the common one for me is the teacher. The teacher, as a miniature colonialist planted in the classroom, saying you cannot use any other language other than the language that has been prescribed, even though in reality the teacher knows that he himself makes sense of the world multilingually. So many teachers in South Africa, for example, they do use a translanguaging, for example, but they use it surreptitiously. So they mustn't be seen to be doing that. So it is the mind of the colonized that is a challenge, and the teacher here is a big stumbling block, if you may put it that way. Yeah, so the communities outside, the kids use English and many other languages around, and that is normal. The local televisions and the soap operas are using a lot of languages. In the minds of the mini maker, there's a lot of languages, the repertoire that is, juggling between a lot of system in your head. The only enemy of decolonizing our education systems is the classroom, where the teacher says, I'm the police. The language policy says that you must only use one language.
Sure.
And even in cases of South Africa, where while the policy says you can, but the mind is not ready to accept it, so they're doing surreptitious. That's the big challenge. It's an advocacy issue about leveraging on multilingualism as a resource, not a problem for our schooling.
Excellent. And I'm asking that especially because in my teaching, sometimes when I come with the other ideas of decolonization, sometimes I have my students saying, really? Why is that? This kind of questions, and they try to, not to refuse, but we feel that they are not really prepared for that. You say, okay, it's not exactly like this, like we are not talking about language. And they all say, okay, but you are teaching English. And said, okay, but we are teaching languages, and you can use the repertoire that you need to make meaning. And sometimes we have all these difficulties. Excellent. Next
And
question.
some teachers,
what? Sorry?
Okay. I was saying sometimes the teachers thinking that the teaching is about them, saying, what if I don't understand many children's languages? And then the question for the teachers, we say, what if the children don't understand when you are being monolingual? So who should we choose in there? So there are spaces where you have got many schools in South Africa, private school, where teachers say, I don't understand the children's languages, therefore I don't allow other. So they make it their own learning instead of their own thing. Yeah, thank you.
Which is challenging for both. Okay, great. The next question then, in your book, I really like this question. You suggest a broadening conceptualization of language policies that integrates Southern and decolonial perspective, which means focusing on real language practices of real people in real life. In this context, how could we take into account the English language and its teaching in countries such as Brazil? Maybe you can use your own example too. Finex, would you start? Finex?
Yeah, well, yes, I would start. This is a simple one, I think. Now, are there people that speak English in Brazil? Yes. So English is it's part of the repertoire of languages that are used in Brazil. So if it's part of the repertoire, then it has to be part of the languages that we teach. All right. You see, it's no longer about thinking about languages in terms of the colonial perspective, but in terms of the local Brazilian person who knows that I use English for these particular strategic purposes to connect with people from this part of the world. So it's a resource they have access to. And I think it's only fair enough to say, well, if there are people that use English in Brazil, why not open the space for teaching the language? The problem comes if you want to bring in English to displace other languages, to say English will be the language of everything, then there's a big problem there. It should come and occupy the particular space where people are using it for particular purposes. All right. Like right now, I mean, we are using English from this end because you are privileged enough to also understand English. We are able to connect. Okay. But if we were to say, for example, let's banish English from Brazil and no one should be using English, how would we be connecting right now? So it's leveraging resources, really. That's what it should be, and nothing more, but just leveraging the resources for different purposes. That's how I would answer that, really. English is a real language of real people. It's part of the real languages of the real people, but it's not the only one. So the problem comes when we think that a particular language is the only thing that will help us do things. That's where the problem is. It's part of the so many other varieties, and they serve different purposes. That takes us back to the idea I spoke of sociolinguistic justice, that every language has its place and has its role. So we look at context and the purposes it serves.
Excellent. We are going to skip the next one, next question, and I would start with Leketi. I'm thinking about the time specifically. This last question, then we have how to build language policies from recentering silenced voices from the global south. Leketi, could you start, please?
And then thank you. Yes, the language policies that are decolonized are language policies that are reflecting the actual use of language. Language as used by the people, not necessarily languages as thought by linguists or the state. So that means even as you write, the languages of Portuguese for you should be English, Brazil, number of local languages. The policy should embed this fluidity. That is the horizontal and the vertical stuff that I was talking about. That the current policies are not being horizontal, are not looking at overlaps. And as soon as they include the overlap between these languages, including in the classroom or elsewhere where it's socially appropriate, then the silenced voices of the people that make sense in those combined or fluid ways would be elevated, and that is greater for humanity.
Excellent.
Yes. So I might add that the question is specific, silenced voices from the global south. So when we talk of silenced voices from the global south in the context of language policies, what we are saying here is that Southern perspectives about how to build languages, they are silenced at the moment. So the point is, can we listen to Southern communities? Can we look at how Southern communities use languages? And then from there, we build language policies by taking into account the views and perspectives of a diverse group of people. Because at the moment, you see, they are stakeholders to language policy making. It's an elitist affair. Often it's top down. We need a bottom-up approach to say, let's listen to the communities. What are they doing with languages? So how can we devise policies such that they serve the interests of the people, as opposed to coming up with a policy and then you ask people to conform? This is how things are at the moment. And yet, from a Southern perspective, this should be a convivial process, collaboration, as equal partners. So let's listen to people on the ground as people who have knowledge. So let's tap into what we call popular knowledge about language. So often we tend to think about expert knowledge, all right? The knowledge that you and I have, the knowledge that, politicians or whoever at the top there, policymakers have. Can we go down and look at popular knowledge about languages and then build on that? What is popular knowledge about languages in the communities? All right. Do they draw these boundaries? Do they hierarchize languages in order to say, this is the minor, this is whatever, this is whatever? How are they looking at languages? So when we listen to them and then build from there, that's how I would approach it from a Southern perspective. Because Southern views and Southern understandings, knowledges, and traditions have been suppressed for a very, very long time. And when we build language policies in Southern countries, what we do is we borrow those templates that come from the Western world or that were imposed by colonizers and try to make things fit in there. But I would say, let's do it the other way around, and yeah, listen to local people, communities. How do they use languages? What do they want? I mean, simply asking people, really, what do you want? A simple question. What do you want about your languages? And just do that. Build a policy along those lines. I mean, it sounds like a simple question, really, a common sense question. The Western world peddles itself about democracy and things like that. But I think we need democracy in language policy making. Yeah, let's go down and ask people, what do they want? And listen to their stories and then incorporate them in building language policies.
Excellent. We are our time now. We are more than 2 hours, and then I would invite you first of all to thank you. But before saying thank you to everybody, would like you to tell us some things, like kind of a summary. If you have to say something for us Brazilians, what would you say? Like how would you summarize in terms of language, in terms of this perspective that that you presented today? In few words.
Do you want to go first, Leketi, or I will go first?
Oh, okay, you go.
Just to summarize.
Okay. Yeah, well, my simple message my simple message to the people of Brazil, and to myself and to other people from the global south is that decolonize yourselves first, and then try to decolonize everything else. That's my simple message. Decolonize yourself first, and then you can proceed with the agenda of decolonizing languages, decolonizing everything. Because unless and until you are decolonized, unless and until the cognitive empire that is in you is removed through decolonizing, you will never be able to decolonize languages or education or anything. Because everything comes up from here. It's in your mind. So let's decolonize our minds first. Decolonize ourselves, and then try to decolonize languages. That's my closing words, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Leketi.
My closing remarks and for the Brazilian people is that ways of knowing and ways of acting and ways of doing go beyond the nitty-gritties and the specifics of language structure. So there's a need for the Brazilians and people in the global south to begin to look at this horizontal angle that we've been trying to say, which is very much about the real people on the ground, how they make sense, how they communicate, rather than what languages look like. And that will be my way.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I would like now, Dan, we are closing our discussion, our excellent discussions. I'm pretty sure we learned a lot. And I'd like to invite Professor Katya to join us for closing our... Katya is there? Yeah, she's coming. Okay, Katya, you're welcome. Your microphone is mute.
Are you hearing me now? Yeah, it's okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yes, no, that's okay.
Oh, I would like to say absolute thank you for this dialogue, because you brought for us, I can say, on transgressive reflection. Then you make our minds work about ourselves as a professor, as a speakers, as a research, and thank you for this opportunity to enjoy with us. And I think, I don't know if you can see, but a lot of people here are telling us how much this was wonderful during this morning. Can you see here, Ozias? Can you see?
Yep. Yeah. Sylvia, you mean the comments? Is that?
Yeah.
The comments?
Yeah, Sylvia. Yeah, the Sylvia,
yes.
and
we have Sylvia.
Yeah, Sylvia, you
Sylvia,
have
Lubia, I don't know if
Lubia. Yes, the part of our group, and the GECAL. Unfortunately, Kleber was not here now. He cannot be in here now, but I'm sure he will say thank you a lot. Thank you so much. Then I think, I don't know if you'd like to say the final words, because I know it's later for all of you. Like, I think Leketi and Finex is like a later for the day, almost 1 a.m. for you, I think so.
Yes.
Then thank you for being here so late for us. And can you see can you say something? The final words.
You're talking with me?
Yeah, no, talk about our guest.
Yeah, I'll go first because I need to go to bed. My wife is waiting for me.
Oh my God.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. You are beautiful people, and I really appreciate that. I'm looking forward to future collaborations on matters of mutual interest. And thank you so much for having me. And I am so grateful that you gave us the platform to share. Yeah, thank you.
Please say.
Thank you so much.
Please say sorry to your wife.
Thank you so much.
Keep you here so long.
And Leketi, we told us that you have to pick up your children.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. We look forward to future collaboration. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you.
So, on the behalf, just to finish up, on the behalf of GECAL and the Proformação and our presenters, obviously, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. And for Finex, a good night. Rest.
Thank you.
Okay.
You sleep very well, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye.
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 Bye. Bye.